All right, it's really good to see you. Sorry that we're starting late. Was doing some OBS stuff that had gotten removed and needed to be put back in place. So we'll work with what we've got.
But our chat will be on tonight.
Hopefully, hopefully. All right, John 7. Jesus has come into the temple. He is coming there so as to teach and to proclaim further information as to who he is, what it is that his mission is in the world. He confronts the Jewish leaders over some of the slanderous statements that they have been making against him. And so specifically, which one? He makes a call back to a specific event in chapter 7.
Moses gave you the law.
Okay.
Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
But what
so
specifically? Okay, keep on.
They're missing the point that Moses wasn't the one who gave them, it was God, right? Kinda.
And we touched on that.
Yeah.
What is it that they're still mad about?
Him healing on the Sabbath.
Okay, healed on the Sabbath day, but then also,
And calling himself God.
all right, making himself equal with God. So then Jesus brings in the illustration of Moses, you circumcise on the Sabbath day so as to keep the law. Well, if you can take a piece of a man away and you're keeping the law, then I can make a man whole and still be keeping the law. So then that is where we have the reason for verse 24 being placed in there. Judge not according to appearance, or to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. And that all of this, if we're going to cause a stink about something, then we better make sure we have our facts straight. And that we are actually causing a stink over something that is in connection with what the law says, with what God says, and not just how we feel about something. Now so in saying that, it's not a situation of, well, if you've got this weird feeling about it, then you can't say anything, you can't bring it up, you can't discuss it. No, that's fine. We need to discuss that kind of stuff. If there's confusion over a matter, then fine, let's discuss that. But do not start trying to build a position on something that you are unsure about and that's just based upon your feeling. Those are two separate issues. So then that brings us to verse 25. Then said some of them of Jerusalem, is not this he whom they seek to kill? Now, Jesus has already made the accusation, Moses gave you the law, but yet you break the law in that you are desiring to go about to kill me. And then the question is raised, well, yeah, you're mad. Who's here wanting to kill you? And then it brings about some further discussion amongst the people and how it is that, okay, here he is. Here's this one that they're saying, well, he's a false teacher. He's a false prophet. He's a deceiver. He's actually casting devils out by the power of the devil. Now, according to the law of Moses, what were you supposed to do with a false prophet?
Kill him.
All right, you're supposed to kill him. You have every right to go about and do that. But now here he is in Jerusalem and he's continuing to teach, and they have not laid hold on him to kill him. So chapter 5, the crowd set out to kill him back then. And there's some general knowledge floating around about this now. There are some that are within the circles that know, okay, this is what they're wanting to do. And verse 26, here's the reason why they're asking the question, why haven't they taken their opportunity? But lo, he speaketh boldly, and they say nothing unto him. Okay, there's no better time than the present. Here you are talking all this big talk about what you're going to do when you see him or when he ends up showing up. Well, here he is, and here's your opportunity. Go ahead, big fellas. Let's see what you're going to do. And yet they do nothing. So then the question ends up being raised, do the rulers now know indeed that this is the very Christ? So now here's what the people start saying on the other hand. Well, okay, if they're not doing anything and nobody's stopping him and nobody's answering him, then that must mean that they have changed their minds and now they're starting to believe. We have a dynamic being presented to us, and there's a power struggle that's taking place. And we know that to be the case. We're going to look at it later on as we move through our presentation, our study this morning, on how it is that the Jewish leaders already have this mindset. They're not wanting to get rid of him simply because of what he's teaching, but it's because of what it's going to do to their position. They are in power. They are the ones in charge. And they're not willing to allow somebody else to have that seat. So we have Jesus going in to the feast secretly. But in going in secretly, it was just so that he could get into the position that he was wanting to be in and needing to be in to be able to do this kind of teaching. And the word boldly, it carries that connotation. You know, there's courage and there's strength in his presentation. But in the Greek, oftentimes, the word boldly just simply means that he's speaking plainly. Simply, he is presenting this information in front of them so that they'll be able to comprehend and that they'll be able to know. So verse 27, howbeit we know this man whence he is, but when Christ cometh, no man knoweth whence he is. So here's the response. The people are now trying to figure out, well, okay, have they started to believe? Well, the opposition then has to start throwing out opposition and argumentation. And this is what they can come up with. No man knows from whence he is. You know, there's just not enough information for us to be able to tell people plainly, tell people straight who the Christ is, what he's going to be like, where he's actually come from, and all these type of different things. More than once, Jesus has stated very plainly that he is from heaven. And as far as what they're going to try to do when they end up contradicting themselves here in just a little bit, all they want to do is try to trace him back to Galilee. And that being, you know, Jesus and his physical lineage. But what they're actually going to end up doing is they're going to end up misinterpreting some of the Old Testament prophets so as to reach this conclusion. And when you read the Old Testament is very clear as to where the Messiah would be born and even what region he was going to go in and do his work. Even down to the very tribe and family tree that the Messiah is going to be in, and then here these religious leaders just, you know, we just don't know where exactly he's going to come. Right, absolutely. And it all goes back to not wanting to let Jesus be in charge. Man having his own will and his own desires, and you have people that they love to feed on these positions of power, and so what they'll do is twist, scheme, pervert, do whatever it is they need to do so as to keep that position. And even as we've gone through our own studies in making these different connections, we've looked at Malachi and how even Malachi said very clearly that the Messiah would come and he would do his work in the temple. So the descriptions are there. But what we're finding with these kind of arguments is that the arguments never change. I mean, when you've been involved in biblical discussion with some of your friends, and especially as I've been involved in biblical discussion with different denominational preachers, are we not oftentimes met with this kind of response? Well, we just really don't know what it means. We just don't know how to, reach different conclusions on this particular matter.
Amen.
It's all around. Why are they doing that? Because they don't want to know. And even then, you're claiming to be the teacher at a certain teacher, preacher, pastor, leader at whatever group that you're with. And it's a situation like Nicodemus, John chapter 3. You're a master over Israel and you don't know these things? These things are being laid out very clearly. But here are the elites, just as we mentioned before, acting as the gatekeepers of information, and they're misleading the people. Yeah, I mean, in this very chapter, Nicodemus is going to make an attempt to stand up in Jesus' defense, right in the midst of the Pharisees, in the midst of the religious leaders. So we are finding people, and that's one of the things we have to be careful, with in our studies and our presentations, that as we're mentioning this about, and we make blanket statements about, well, here are the Jews acting certain ways. But it's not all the Jews, is it? No. There are a small group that are watching this, observing this, and really taking these things in. And like Nicodemus, he's battling this whole situation because he's in the very same predicament as these Jewish leaders. And he is having to count the cost. Okay, if I throw my hat in with Jesus, this circle right here is going to turn on me. And they're going to kick me out. And that's difficult. It's a difficult thing to have to be comfortable with being thrown on the outside. And another one that we have made mention of, though he's not mentioned throughout any of the gospel accounts, but if Saul is as truly devoted as he claims to be, Saul is in this too. That is, we're here at the Feast of Tabernacle and Jesus is doing this stuff. Saul is there watching it. And he's listening. And that even though he ends up being one of the ones that's persecuting the church, this is going to be one of the things that he is struggling with and battling with, that Jesus says, you're kicking against the pricks. So it's a situation of having to go against the status quo. Well, okay, here's how we've always done things. Here are the people that are in charge. Here are the ones running the show. And it's just, well, what are we going to do? You got to stand up against it. What Jesus is doing is, he's leading a revolution here. And that he's going against their system in trying to bring them back to God's system. But as what we have recorded here in verse 27, this isn't the first time that we've seen the religious leaders have to claim ignorance, though, is it? Isn't there somewhere else where they actually had to turn around to the people and say, well, we don't know? Okay, so that's the one I was thinking about. Did you find what you were thinking about in John 3?
No, it was.
Oh, was that it? Okay.
Yeah, because they had to turn around because they couldn't.
Right.
They couldn't answer.
Yeah.
If it's from God, they have to allow
Okay,
it.
all right. So the other situation is Matthew 21:27. And they answered Jesus and said, we cannot tell. But we know from the Holy Spirit's record that they did know. Because it's recorded in Matthew 21 exactly what Reese said. Well, they're reasoning amongst themselves. If we say it's from God, then he's going to turn it on us and say, well, why haven't you obeyed it? But if we say it's from men, and that John actually is not a prophet of God, they feared the people. So there's a situation of trying to play both sides. But also that element of fearing the people, worrying about what people will say or what people will think, and allowing that to determine how we're going to be. That's peer pressure. And we've mentioned it time and time again in our studies, and that we think about peer pressure as being something that children deal with, middle schoolers and teenagers and all that kind of stuff, but you never grow out of peer pressure. There's always going to be people around that either you look up to or that you want to try to fit in with, and they're going to try to have you be like them. And if we don't have our own convictions about things and stand on our own understanding about what's right and wrong, then we're going to allow those things to shift and to sway us. So a prime example of this, just last week, Wednesday night, we had the Republican Central Committee meeting, and really the main thrust of that meeting was to find out which different candidates the group here in Lake County was going to put their backing behind. Well, it came to the section of trying to figure out, are we going to endorse Tanner Smith or Greg Gianforte for governor? The majority of the group is in favor of Tanner Smith. But one person spoke up and said that she didn't think that we needed to endorse either one. And her thinking was, because if we end up endorsing Tanner Smith and Gianforte ends up winning, then he might want to try to retaliate. We don't want to end up on the wrong side of the governor. That's this right here. There is absolutely no reason, now this is not an official endorsement by the Church of Christ of Lake County for either candidate. But in looking at the record, there's no reason for any sane Republican conservative person to endorse Greg Gianforte, especially in this area. He's not done anything to help this county. But fear of retaliation. And guess what ended up happening in that meeting with that endorsement? It was left vacant. Right now, the Lake County Central Committee has not endorsed either candidate. And all it took was one person to mess up the whole entire thing. And it's because of this, worried about what other people are going to think. Go ahead, Jamie. Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, when you put it together, let me know. All right. So this stuff is happening all around us. Well, we don't want to do this because it might cause these people to look at us funny. Or we don't want to do this because, it might put a bad taste in their mouth. But if we're watching how not only Jesus, but even John, when it came to dealing with political powers, we already saw Jesus with Nicodemus. He didn't pull any punches with Nicodemus, and he's just as much a political leader as he is a religious leader. But what about John the Immerser? How did he confront a political power?
Brother's what?
Yeah, Herod, you're not supposed to have your brother's wife. Well, John, hold on a second. You don't want to get sideways with Herod. You don't want to do anything to put your name on his bad list.
You don't want to lose your head.
Yeah. But see, that's politics. We don't play these politics games. If it's wrong, it's wrong, and it needs to be pointed out. And if they want to get mad and retaliate, that just further shows you the evil character that they have. So that right there within itself, when that person said that in that meeting, it's just like, well, okay, if you're thinking that this is the kind of person Gianforte is, why would you want him in office? And that he's the kind of person, well, if you stand up against him, he's going to retaliate. You've said too much. But as we're saying, again, this is not an endorsement by the Church of Christ Lake County on either candidate. It's just a use of illustration and example of how this happens all around us. Happens in that realm, happens in religion, happens at work. I mean, just everything. People trying to have their influence on us. And we're needing to try to have our influence on them. Now here, what we're fixing to have in verse 28 is going to be a key element to help us be able to do that. Then cried Jesus in the temple as he taught, saying, Ye both know me, and ye know whence I am. And I am not come of myself, but he that sent me is true, whom ye know not. The word cried is a primary verb properly to croak as a raven, or literally to scream. In the genitive case, to call aloud, to shriek, exclaim, to entreat, cry out. This is a proclamation with emotion. And if you remember, this group is focusing on the miracles and not what Jesus is teaching. And in the midst of all of their back and forth together, Jesus interrupts them by shouting over their discussions. He is making a strong emotional appeal of what he is about to teach. There is zeal, there is fervor in what he is presenting. And this is an important element because most people think that when it comes to having discussions like this, what are you supposed to do with your emotions?
Hold back.
Hold them back, conceal them. Ultimately, just going through argumentation, not allowing for any type of emotion to come forth. But here we have Jesus in the midst of the temple teaching, and he shouts with an emotional decree. And we've already seen, in which I know we've not gone through a study of Mark, but we've made connection to the event in Mark chapter 3, I believe it is, that Jesus answered his critics out of the emotion of anger. In the separate occasion where he was going to heal on the Sabbath day, and Jesus knew that they were standing around waiting to see if he would do it. And the text says that Jesus looked on them with anger. And then he did what he did and he said what he said. Now, part of the reason why our brotherhood has gone over into this area of presenting with a lack of emotion, and I mean, rightfully so. If our emotions are not kept in check, then we can end up doing something or saying something that we shouldn't. But that doesn't mean that we need a complete removal or that it is always wrong to have some kind of emotion involved in what we're doing. And part of what it is that it's similar to the whole, well, you're in a discussion with somebody and they want to throw, you say something that they don't like, and they want to throw out these terms that are designed to try to reel you back. Somebody tries to call you a racist. And it's just because you've said something that they don't like and that may be true about a particular group of people, and then all of a sudden you got to try to defend yourself and how that you're not racist. Well, the same thing ends up happening in situations like this, to where you're in a discussion with somebody and people want to try to throw out, well, why are you getting angry? And even with myself, I've used that from time to time to try to kind of throw people off, or usually it's in a context dealing with denominational folk, and I'm really afraid that they're going to put their hands on me. And it's to try to, catch them and to have them realize what they're doing. But in every situation, when there is a show of emotion, we don't need to try to use that as a weaponry thing or a tactic as though they're wrong for what they're doing. There's absolutely nothing wrong with being in a situation and being in a discussion, and it's something that's causing your blood to boil. I mean, in Acts 17, when Paul is on Mars Hill, what do we have being described about his emotion? He was stirred. His spirit was stirred when he saw the whole city given to idolatry. If there's something to get angry over, I think that would be it. So when it comes to us standing our ground for what's right, and then we want to have some zeal and some conviction and some fervency in our position like this, there's nothing wrong with using that. And anybody that would, in fact, try to use that against us, all it is a tactic to get away from what's being said to the way that you said it. And that's not what we need to pay attention to. But then focusing in on, so with that discussion, before we then dive into what he's actually saying. Any thoughts? Questions? All right. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
This is the Jesus who the Bible is revealing to us that we know, versus the light and fluffy. Jesus never got mad, and Jesus wouldn't ever do this, and this is how we present him, that we've seen from denominations and even within our own lives of this is who we know is somebody who never got mad. I mean, even though the text says so, and we know it's righteous, but and there's times when he had sarcasm too. So he didn't hold back those emotions and just trying to accept that reality, but use it in self-control, which is what he did, versus say Moses or us. You know, if we lose sight of what we're trying to accomplish.
And then it's a situation too of where, so in this situation, the crowd is a mixture of all kinds of people, to where you have these religious leaders that are just flat out not wanting to listen to him, they're not wanting to follow him. But then, as we mentioned, you got people like Nicodemus and Saul who are in this crowd, and okay, they're listening, they're taking these things in, considering these things that are happening. His brethren that we just studied in chapter 6, and how do they feel about him?
Go away.
Just, we don't want you here. We don't believe you are who you claim that you be.
You're mad.
You're crazy. But then you also have Jesus' mother, who's going to be in this crowd too. And the other women who are following along with Jesus and ministering to him as he's ministering to others. And then this is the kind of action that all of those people collectively are getting from Jesus. And that here's what they are seeing him do on the... Are we on the last day of the feast? No, that hasn't come yet. No, it is. Hold on. No, it's not. Yeah, 37. Nope. Why can't I find myself?
No, on the last day.
Okay, yeah, so 37, last day of the feast. Okay, so we're not there yet. But here, here we are in the, in the midst of this, and this is what Jesus is having to, this is what he's going to say to the whole, whole entire crowd. But then there are those inside of the crowd that have to examine themselves, and they have to come to the conclusion within themselves, well, okay, he's not talking to me in what he's presenting here. So now let's look at what he says. Here's what he's teaching them. Saying, ye both know me, and ye know whence I am. And I am not come of myself, but he that sent me is true, whom ye know not. And this is what he's shouting to the entire crowd. Millions of Jews that are going to be in Jerusalem at the time of this feast. And here's the reality of the kind of people that Jesus was dealing with then and the kind of people that we're dealing with today. Now, when he says to them, ye know whence I am, you both know me and whence I am. They knew he was from Galilee. And they're even going to try to lie, and they have lied in the past about who his father is. But they all know about his birth. They know that Joseph is not his actual father. But then you look at this statement here. And that this is what Jesus is proclaiming, shouting to the crowd. Can you imagine how mad, how angry this would have made a Jew back during this time? He that sent me is true. Well, who is that?
You already said it earlier.
Who is it?
God.
It's- Okay. Now, I like the way Jamie said it. But you're right, you're right.
I'm good.
But the God they follow. And here Jesus says, you don't even know him.
But we go through the motions.
Aha. But here we are at this feast that God commanded us to observe. That we're supposed to be coming here to remember what God did for our forefathers in leading them through the wilderness. And then right in the middle of all of this religious and solemn, holy activity, and here is this man from Galilee, and he stands up and says, you don't know God. That's the kind of Jesus we're dealing with. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about he is teaching plainly to them. Yeah, you're here, but you're not following God. Well, no, you can't just say that to anybody. That might run them away. That might turn them off. That might push them away from following. They're not following anyways. You're not losing anything. But you see, this goes back to the fear of what people will think. There are people today that are going and attempting to worship God, but they do not know God. And many, and I would even argue most of the people that we just mentioned are our own brethren. Because that's who Jesus is talking to here. He is talking to Jews. He's talking to Israelites, seed of Abraham. And he is standing in front of them all and saying, you don't know God. And there's nothing wrong with us making that kind of claim, saying those kind of things to our own brethren and to people that are out in the world. Is it going to make them mad? More than likely. But is it the truth? Is it the reality that we're in? Is it the fact of the matter? Yes, it is. And why would we try to hide that? Hide the truth so as to spare their feelings? It's not how Jesus operated.
I can't remember the statistic, if it was you that brought it up, but Indians cannot handle alcohol.
Right, yeah.
They're more susceptible to having
Yeah.
liver failure and all that type of stuff. So with that same concept in mind, we are the people that need to hear this the most because, well, no, we are the church. We are the this and that. And so 4 generations down, we have, you don't preach this at home. You know, we have that type of mentality going on because we think we have it, just like the Jews. So we are the ones that when you go to a denominational person and you're talking, okay, the first church and all that stuff, and they're realizing, whoa, I never had it in the first place. Something gets wiped away from them that, okay, I can accept this. For us, it's like, I've already gone through this.
Yeah.
You're right. I'm already saved. I'm already circumcised. I'm going to the feast. So we have that avenue of Jesus. So we're the ones that need to be listening to this hardcore.
And that is one of the main thrusts of our classes, is that, okay, before we start trying to take this information and apply it to somebody else, this all starts here. Can we, as we're sitting here today, can we honestly look at this statement and us honestly say, no, I know God? Do we honestly know Him as He's laid out in Scripture, or do we just know Him based upon whatever tradition's been passed down to us?
Well, not only just tradition, but also individually what we want to create him to be.
Ah, that's good. That's good. Yeah, what's our personal view or our personal relationship with who Jesus is?
Something you said earlier, and I wanted to touch on it, was for these people, as Jesus is speaking to them in this way, the religious world now says, well, you can't do that because Jesus is all loving. But as you're pointing out, these people don't know who God is, so you're not really losing anything. But some of the time, and there's a couple examples I have, is you gain something from speaking to people like this. There's Nicodemus, and then there's Saul turning into Paul. There's these Jews that are hard-headed, hard-hearted, going through life, and if you don't speak this way to them, then you're never going to change their mind. If you keep coddling them or telling them, the denominational view of how Jesus is just all love, it's never going to change their mind, because they're stuck in their sin, and they'll never change because they don't have the conviction to change. But then you see Nicodemus, and then you see Saul turning into Paul, that because of these things that Jesus spoke, because of the way that he spoke and how he treated them, it's kind of a wake-up call to them of, wow, I need to do something and further investigate.
Because it was a challenge. And they had to consider the challenge.
Right. So hold on to it. One thing you said about how the world views Jesus as being all, he's all loving all the time. But that's one of the things we've talked about in our classes over and over again, is changing our view on what love is. And even aligning our definition with the Bible's definition of love. This is a loving act that's being performed on the part of Jesus, on the part of God. He is telling them what they're needing to hear. And isn't that even something that what did Dr. Nace say about that? It's...
Yeah, love, or the truth trumps love almost, because if you're not willing to tell the truth.
Right, but he said something about being able to tell people the truth, or what they're needing to hear, is the greatest level of, only words come to mind is valor, but it's like respect or whatever for the other person.
Virtue.
Maybe, yes, maybe virtue.
Yep.
And she's like, okay, here's a denominational person, and he's saying the correct thing, but how often is he willing to do that?
He's not, because we can't get a hold of him.
That's right. He won't come talk to us about what we're needing to hear.
He'll write about it.
Well, I mean, so I guess to some degree, he kind of is roundabout talking to us. But it's just, nobody likes being the bearer of bad news. But even with this isn't just bad news. because the good news is right there in front of them. Okay, you don't know Him, but I know Him. So here's your source of information. Here's how you can come to know Him. For I am from Him, and He hath sent me. And what Jesus is trying to illustrate to them is they do not have what He has. Jesus said flat out, you do not know God. And with the statement of, I know Him, for I am from Him. That is closeness and fellowship. I was there with Him. I was there at His side. And He's saying to them, you're not there. You are not there in that closeness of fellowship. What Jesus is describing here, it's John 1:1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He had been with God from the beginning. There's that closeness of fellowship, like it was in the garden. When the Spirit of God, or the voice of God, walked in the garden with Adam and Eve. And here they are experiencing that same thing. And what Jesus is describing and talking to this group of people about their situation, that is the case of millions of people today. They are going through rituals today thinking that they're in fellowship with God, but are not. And that's one of the things that we were saying about John's record. And that with John's record, John is revealing to the audience then, and he's revealing to us today who God is. In His nature, His character, His compassion, but also in His anger and His wrath and His zeal. In His integrity of always wanting to do what is right, what is true, and what is just. And that's the reason why in the Hebrew letter, in the Hebrew epistle in chapter 3, it records for us that Jesus is an apostle, the chief apostle. And that word just simply means somebody sent, and that He is sent of God. And that this book is teaching all the way through that Jesus was in fact with God and sent by God into the world to reveal God to the world and to complete His work. And I don't think that we really made that point as we were going through our introduction. But it's a good point for us to make here. That as we're considering the work that Jesus went to do was to reveal God to the world, and then who was the first group of people that Jesus was sent to reveal God to?
Say that again.
Who was the first group of people that Jesus was sent to them to reveal to them who God is? The Jews. They should have already known who God is. They should have already been understanding all of these things that we're discussing and all these things that we're breaking down. But it's what Jordan mentioned, it's what we mentioned in our classes before. You move further and further down the line in generation, and you start forgetting this stuff. And you start losing track of where all of this information came from. Well, that's just something that our mom and dad believed in. That's just something that was passed down to us. Well, this is just what grandma and grandpa did. We say, we make those kind of statements about why the Baptists and different ones do the things that they do, but a lot of our own brethren today, the reason why they're doing what they're doing today is simply because, this is what grandma and grandpa did.
It's the Church of Christ thing.
It's the Church of Christ thing, in that it's not actually from God. That's just what happens with the passage of time. And then once again, so we'll close today with verse 30. By him saying what he's just said, we find one element of response. Well, what's going to happen if we teach like Jesus taught and we say the things that Jesus said? Then they sought to take him. And as we said before, they're not wanting to take him to dinner. They are Yeah. They are wanting to take him and lay him outside of the city and put him to death. Are you going to get that kind of response in telling people what they need to hear? Yes, you will. But we're going to find in just a moment that as this ends up happening, verse 31 then comes into play. And many of the people believed on him. But what do we want to get hung up on? We want to get hung up on, well, you made these people mad, so what? Let them get mad. Just because they're mad now does not mean that they won't end up turning around later. And most of the people that we had to obey the gospel in Virginia was because they started out like this. They were so aggravated and so irritated by the things that we were saying on television, talking about their church, talking about their preacher, and their preacher wouldn't do anything about it. So just like what we have here, the religious leaders would not do anything about it. So guess what they started doing? They started digging. Well, my preacher won't shut them up. I'm going to shut them up. And that got them to study their Bibles seriously for the first time. And many of them ended up just teaching themselves out of their denominational doctrine. And they came to us saying, you know, I'd never seen this before, and the reason why you'd never seen it before is because you're not studying to find it for yourself. So here they are, and they're mad. Okay. But we're finding that no man laid hands on him because his hour was not yet come. So here we catch glimpses of God's rule over this world. God had a purpose and God had a mission that was working on God's timetable. And the time in which God was working would not be decided or interrupted by men. You're not going to slow it up. You're not going to speed it up. God knew exactly what was going to happen, and it was happening exactly as He designed it. And that Jesus will say later in John 10:18, no man taketh it from me, speaking of His life, but I lay it down of myself. Again, another statement implementing or implying His control over the entire situation. But even though that is the case here, we need to be careful about trying to use passages like this and trying to apply it to our lives. Everyone wants to try, and they'll even use passages like this, and they'll want to try and put purpose and reason to everything that happens. But are we really able to do that? Now, we can say perhaps. That's what Paul wrote to Philemon about Onesimus running away, finding Paul, converting, and then Paul was able to send him back. And that even Paul, an apostle, in the time frame where miracles were happening, he had to look at that event and say, perhaps. And the reason why is because you do not have a God-given statement that that was him doing it. And that's what you have here. There has to be some kind of statement like this to go with the event, to know for sure that it was God's doing. Sometimes things just happen. We live in a world with natural law. You try to go against natural law, you're going to get hurt. Bad things are going to happen. And that even with things that we've been involved in together. One of the big things about going to Idaho and then on the way back, Jordan hitting that rock. Well, Jordan run over that rock on the way back from Idaho. Well, God had a purpose behind that. No, rocks fall off of cliff sides all the time. But even with not being able to put a definite, finite point on, well, why did that happen? There were a lot of lessons that came out of it.
You and Jordan should ride together?
Yeah.
Perhaps.
A lot of lessons, a lot of experiences. It wasn't something that just went by null and void. So when we're thinking about things like that, it's like, okay, yeah, there's always something to learn from stuff. But it does not always have to be a situation of, well, God did that. Now, some things, man, it just, like what Paul is saying, some things just end up happening and you're just left shaking your head. That it's more than coincidence. But unless there's some type of direct statement of saying, well, okay, God actually did this, we got to be careful. And then also, when we're thinking about these statements about Jesus, Jesus was sent on a very specific mission. And even when we're considering things like Joseph and how those things all laid out and how all those things played out, that was all in connection with making sure that the Messiah came into the world. Yes? Sorry, that's my shaker cup. I didn't know if, yeah, no, I didn't. I don't know if she's thinking or what's going on. And so when we think about that, like when we're thinking about what's laid out in the Scriptures and how it is that things are playing out and moving forward, it's all in connection with, well, okay, we got to bring the Messiah into the world. All right, Messiah has come into the world. So then when it comes down to our lives today, we don't have that kind of connection to God's plan other than waiting for the Messiah to return. And that everything that we are involved in and working and laboring and going out and spreading forth seed or casting out seed is trying to get things ready for when that happens. So it's a difficult situation, but it's really not that difficult. And even with what we're discussing here, it's going to come into play in a little bit further when we get down to verses 38 and 39, And specifically 39, but this spake he of the Spirit, which they that believe on him should receive, for the Holy Ghost was not yet given, because that Jesus was not yet glorified. And that people want to come across that verse and they just completely lose their minds over, well, what does that mean? But to just kind of bring all of this to a close, I'm not using this as an attempt to remove God's involvement from what's going on in this world. I'm not trying to do that. Providence is still very much a factor. And that being the interweaving of God's involvement so as to have different things done, to have His will be done. And we know what His will is for the day. Go out, spread the message, edify the church. Be benevolent. And so for Him to be able to work things out in a manner and means to be able to, accommodate that, I'm in full confidence that kind of thing is happening. And even as we talk about the things that have gone on with the work here. What it took to get all of us together. I can't say 100% that God did that, but it's one of those things of being too far outside of the realm of coincidence. To say that there was not any involvement. So though they get angry here, as we said, verse 31, many of the people believed on him and said, when Christ cometh, will he do more miracles than these which this man hath done? So all they're believing on him, they still are not getting it. Because they're raising the question, when Christ comes, will he do more than this man? Well, no, this is the one. This is God's Son. This is the revelation of God to mankind. And even, eventually these same ones will end up falling away from the level of belief that they have here. So while you have those, of course, being in a negative, here are those that are still on the side of positive. They're trying to work it out. And we cannot be too critical of this group, because doesn't this sound like somebody else that asked the same question? Or a similar question? Matthew 11. John sent 2 of his disciples, and what are they asking?
Are you really the Christ?
Are you the one, or are we waiting for somebody else?
Tell them of us today.
When Christ comes, will he do more miracles? Are you the one, or are we waiting for somebody else? And there's nothing wrong with them asking that question, because all things haven't been fulfilled. Everything about the Messiah has not yet happened. Isaiah 53 is still on the table. But we're seeing the seed being planted, starting to grow, and the conclusion of that growth hasn't been seen yet. Where are these people going to end up landing? Well, some will be the stony ground, some will be the thorns, but some are going to be that good soil. To where some are going to produce 30, 60, and 100-fold. But then verse 32 is going to go into deeper problems with the Pharisees, and we'll get more of the negative side as we move into that next week. But any questions or comments on where on up to verse 31? Okay. Then we will stick our pin right there.